The wooden chapel of Willow Creek stood silent except for the soft sobs of Divine Bennett. Dressed in ivory satin and delicate lace, she sat alone in her wheeled chair, abandoned on what should have been the happiest day of her life. The bouquet of dried wildflowers trembled in her gloved hands as the reality sank in: her groom wasn't coming. Have you ever had your heart shattered so completely that breathing itself becomes an act of courage? Divine whispered to the empty church, her voice echoing against the wooden walls. The clock had struck 2 hours past the ceremony's scheduled time. The guests had filed out, their pitying glances more painful than any physical wound Divine had endured since losing the use of her legs 3 years prior. "I never asked for pity," she said, her voice surprisingly steady despite the tears tracking down her cheeks. "Only for honesty. If you've ever felt betrayed by someone you trusted completely, you'll understand the crushing weight pressing against Divine's chest in that moment." The man who had promised her condition didn't matter had proven those words hollow. What happens when your worst fear becomes reality? When the whispers you tried to silence, that no one could truly love someone in a wheeled chair, are validated in the most public, humiliating way possible? Stay with me to discover how this abandoned bride found unexpected love with a man who saw beyond her wheelchair to the extraordinary woman within. Like this video if you've ever had to rebuild your life after devastating disappointment. Autumn 1875 painted Montana territories rolling prairies in amber and gold. Divine Bennett had never imagined herself confined to a wheeled chair at age 26. With copper hair and eyes the color of prairie sage, she had once danced at every social gathering back in Illinois. The stagecoach accident changed everything. Traveling west to accept a teaching position, Divine's journey ended at the bottom of a ravine. When she awoke in the doctor's home days later, the verdict was clear: her legs would never again carry her. "You have 2 choices," the frontier doctor had told her bluntly. "Surrender to despair or adapt to your new reality." Divine chose the latter. Her nimble fingers could mend torn clothing, craft intricate embroidery, and most importantly, guide children through their lessons at Willow Creek's small schoolhouse. "Miss Bennett makes the letters dance," one student told his mother. "When she reads to us, it's like the stories come alive right there in the room." Teaching became her salvation. Each morning, her father would will her to the schoolhouse, where her disability seemed to fade into the background. Between arithmetic and geography, Divine found purpose again. It was at a school function that Thomas Blackwell first approached her. The handsome merchant's son had recently returned from back east, bringing with him fine manners and ambitious plans for expanding his father's business. "Your students adore you," he'd remarked, pulling a chair beside her wheeled one. "It's clear you have a gift." Their courtship progressed with surprising speed. Thomas would appear at the schoolhouse with wildflowers or a book he thought she might enjoy. He seemed unbothered by her condition, pushing her chair along the town's boardwalks with apparent pride. "Your condition doesn't matter to me," he'd whisper, kneeling beside her chair. "I see your heart, Divine, and it's more beautiful than any pair of dancing feet." She believed him. Perhaps she wanted to believe him too much. When Thomas proposed after just 3 months, Divine hesitated only briefly before accepting. The gold band he slipped onto her finger felt like a promise that her life would not be defined by what she had lost, but by what she had found. The wedding preparations consumed the small settlement for weeks. Divine sewed her own gown, incorporating lace her mother had posted from back east. The town's women rallied around her, treating her upcoming nuptials as a collective victory. "Even out here, love finds a way," Mrs. Peterson from the general store declared as she donated ribbon for the chapel decorations. On her wedding day, snow dusted the ground like confectioner's sugar. Divine's wheeled chair had been adorned with white lilies and silver bells. Her heart thundered beneath her corset as her father pushed her toward her new life. But Thomas never arrived. 1 hour turned to 2. Whispers rippled through the congregation. Divine sat motionless, her expression shifting from nervous anticipation to dawning horror. When Thomas's father finally entered, hat in hand and shame in his eyes, the collective gasp was audible. Miss Bennett, he said, his voice barely carrying across the silent chapel. My son has taken the eastbound train. He left a letter. Says he couldn't. The man's voice cracked. Couldn't commit himself to a life with special burdens. The pity in the eyes around her was unbearable. Her father moved to will her away, but Divine raised a trembling hand to stop him. I would like a moment alone, she said. Please. They filed out, boots shuffling against worn floorboards, until only Divine remained, abandoned in her finery beneath the simple wooden cross. Have you ever been betrayed by someone who swore they accepted you completely? Comment below if you've experienced the sting of rejection for something beyond your control. 40 miles away, in a sprawling ranch house nestled against pine-covered hills, James Harrington sat beside his son's bed, listening to the same prayer he'd heard every night for the past 2 years. And please, God, 8-year-old William whispered, his small hands clasped tightly, send a mama who won't mind that I talk too much, and who'll read stories with all the voices, and who'll love Pa again so his eyes don't look so sad. James swallowed hard, smoothing the boy's tousled hair. Since losing Martha in childbirth 2 years ago, he'd thrown himself into building the Double H into one of the territory's most prosperous cattle operations. But the empire of grass and beef meant nothing when he returned each night to a house devoid of feminine warmth. Time for sleep, William, he said gently. But how will God know what kind of mama to send if I don't tell him? The boy asked with unassailable logic. James smiled despite himself. I reckon God's pretty good at figuring these things out. The following day brought business to Willow Creek. James needed to discuss shipping contracts with the stationmaster and had brought William along, promising the treat of penny candy at the general store afterward. They were crossing the town square when James noticed a solitary figure by the creek bank, a woman in a wheeled chair, still dressed in what was unmistakably a wedding gown, though it was smudged at the hem. Even from a distance, there was something in her posture, a dignified grace despite what must be crushing circumstances. Pa, William tugged at his sleeve. Why is that lady in a wedding dress? Did she get married? I don't know, son, James replied quietly. But I suspect not. She looks sad. Like you do sometimes. Children and their devastating observations. James hesitated, then steered William toward the creek bank. Propriety might demand they leave a stranger to her grief, but something stronger pushed him forward. Excuse me, ma'am, he called softly. Are you in need of assistance? When she turned, James felt an unexpected jolt. Despite reddened eyes and tear-stained cheeks, hers was a face of striking beauty, not in the conventional way of painted ladies or society belles, but something deeper. Character etched in every line. Thank you, sir, but I require nothing except privacy, she replied, her voice cultured but firm. William, however, had already darted forward with a child's lack of social awareness. Your dress is the prettiest thing I ever saw, he declared. Did you marry somebody? William, James began, mortified. But the woman's expression softened as she looked at the boy. No, young man. It appears I did not. That's good, William nodded seriously. Because my pa needs a wife, and I need a mama, and you look nice. James would have gladly let the earth swallow him whole in that moment. William. That's quite enough. I apologize profoundly, ma'am. My son speaks without thinking. To his surprise, a ghost of a smile touched the woman's lips. At least he speaks honestly. That's more than can be said for some men. I'm Divine Bennett, she said after a moment, seemingly deciding that conversation was preferable to continued solitude. James Harrington, he replied with a slight bow. And this presumptuous matchmaker is my son, William. The schoolteacher, William exclaimed. Pa, she's the lady everyone says teaches letters even though she can't walk. Bobby Miller is in her class and says she's the best teacher ever. Divine's chin lifted slightly. I find my mind works perfectly well even if my legs do not. Something about her quiet dignity struck James deeply. Here was a woman who had clearly been dealt a brutal hand yet faced the world with unwavering courage. "Miss Bennett," he said impulsively, "would you allow us to escort you home? Or wherever you might wish to go? This doesn't seem the day to be alone." She studied him for a long moment, as if searching for mockery or pity in his expression. Finding neither, she nodded once. "My father's house, if you would be so kind. It's the small yellow cottage beyond the mercantile." If you're enjoying this story of unexpected connections, hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more heartwarming historical tales that remind us how love appears when we least expect it. As James moved behind her chair, William skipped alongside, chattering about school and horses and 1,000 other things. To James's surprise, Devine responded thoughtfully to each question, drawing the boy out with the skilled patience of an experienced teacher. By the time they reached the cottage, William was utterly enchanted. As Devine's father emerged, concern etched in his weathered face, the boy turned to James with shining eyes. "Pa," he whispered loudly enough for everyone to hear, "I think God sent her to us." 2 weeks passed. The scandal of Devine's abandonment faded into the background of frontier life, where survival demanded more attention than gossip. She returned to teaching, throwing herself into her work with renewed vigor. If her smile didn't quite reach her eyes, her students never noticed. James Harrington, however, couldn't forget her. The image of Devine in her soiled wedding gown, facing devastation with quiet dignity, haunted him. He recognized in her the same resilience he'd had to find within himself after Martha's death. One crisp Saturday, he found himself directing his wagon toward Willow Creek again, William bouncing excitedly beside him. "Are we really inviting Miss Bennett to dinner, Pa? Did you cook something nice? Your cooking isn't very good, you know." James laughed. Mrs. Hodges helped prepare everything. Their housekeeper had been suspiciously enthusiastic about this dinner invitation. "And yes, we're inviting Miss Bennett, but she may decline. She's had a difficult time." "She won't say no," William said with absolute certainty. "I prayed about it." Devine's father answered their knock, eyebrows rising at the sight of James Harrington on his doorstep. The cattle baron's reputation as both a successful businessman and a man of integrity was well known throughout the territory. "Mr. Bennett," James removed his hat. "I wonder if I might speak with your daughter." Minutes later, they sat in the modest parlor, Devine's wheeled chair positioned near the window where light fell across her simple blue dress. She looked different than she had by the creek, composed, guarded. "Mr. Harrington. This is unexpected. Please, call me James." He cleared his throat. "Miss Bennett, Devine, I've come with an invitation. William and I would be honored if you would join us for dinner at our home tomorrow." She blinked, clearly surprised. "You're inviting me to dinner? May I ask why?" Direct and forthright. James appreciated that. "Because William hasn't stopped talking about you for 2 weeks, he said honestly. And because I enjoyed our conversation, brief though it was." Despite the circumstances, she added with a hint of bitterness. "Because of them, perhaps." James leaned forward. "You showed remarkable strength that day, Miss Bennett. I admire that." Color touched her cheeks. "You needn't feel obligated out of pity, Mr. Harrington." "James," he corrected gently. "And this isn't pity. It's admiration." Her eyes searched his, looking for deception and finding none. Finally, she nodded. "I accept your invitation, James." William whooped with delight. The dinner was the first of many. Through the long winter months, James found increasingly transparent reasons to visit Willow Creek. Devine began receiving invitations to Sunday dinners, holiday celebrations, and eventually, everyday meals at the Harrington Ranch. What began as tentative friendship blossomed into something deeper. James discovered in Devine a sharp mind and gentle wisdom that complemented his practical nature. She found in him a man who saw beyond her wheelchair to the woman inside, who valued her thoughts and respected her independence. William simply adored her, soaking up her stories and reveling in the maternal attention he'd lacked since birth. "Miss Devine knows all about stars and Indians and presidents," he announced proudly to Mrs. Hodges after one particularly engaging history lesson. "And she doesn't mind when I ask 100 questions." The housekeeper exchanged knowing glances with James. "That child has adopted her already," she murmured when William was out of earshot. "And if I'm not mistaken, so have you." James couldn't deny it. Devine's presence had transformed their home from a place of quiet grief to one filled with laughter and warmth. He found himself watching her, the graceful movement of her hands as she taught William to fold paper boats, the thoughtful tilt of her head as she considered a question, the rare but radiant smile that transformed her entire face. Have you ever witnessed how the right person can heal wounds you thought would never close? Drop a heart in the comments if you believe in second chances at happiness. By spring's first thaw, the residents of Willow Creek and surrounding ranches had grown accustomed to seeing James Harrington's wagon arriving at the schoolhouse each afternoon, the cattle baron himself lifting the schoolteacher into the seat beside him with tender care. "He looks at her like she hung the moon," Mrs. Peterson remarked to her husband as they watched James carefully arrange a blanket across Devine's lap before climbing up beside her. "After what that Blackwell boy did to her, she deserves someone who sees her worth," her husband replied. And James did see her worth, not as someone to be pitied or accommodated, but as a woman of extraordinary strength and grace. He admired how she refused to let her disability define her, how she met challenges with quiet determination rather than complaint. For Devine, James represented everything Thomas was not: honest, dependable, and genuinely accepting of her limitations without making them the center of their relationship. "You never make me feel broken," she told him one evening as he carried her from the wagon to the porch swing. "You're not broken," he replied simply. "Just differently abled than most." As spring progressed, Devine became a fixture at the Harrington ranch. She taught William at the kitchen table when school was not in session, read to him for hours on the wide porch, and even learned to manage household accounts for Mrs. Hodges. "You've brought life back to this place," the housekeeper told her one afternoon as they prepared preserves. "Before you came, it was just a house. Now it's becoming a home again." Devine blushed at the implication. "James and I are just friends." Mrs. Hodges raised an eyebrow but said nothing more. The truth was more complicated. Devine found herself thinking of James at odd moments, the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled, how gently his calloused hands handled delicate things, the deep rumble of his laugh. But she couldn't allow herself to hope for more. A man like James Harrington could have any woman, she reminded herself sternly. Why would he choose one who can't even walk beside him? On a warm April evening, as wildflowers painted the prairie in a riot of color, James and Devine sat on the ranch house's wide porch. William had fallen asleep with his head in Devine's lap, her fingers gently stroking his hair. "He sees you as a miracle, you know," James said quietly. Devine looked up, questioning. "The night before we met you, he prayed for a mother who would love stories and wouldn't mind his chatter." James's voice grew husky. "When we found you by the creek, he was convinced God had answered his prayer." Devine's hand stilled on William's head. "And what do you see, James?" The question hung between them, weighted with months of unspoken feelings. "I see a woman who taught me that life doesn't end with loss," he said finally. "I see strength and grace and beauty that has nothing to do with walking or dancing." He reached for her hand. "I see the miracle I never thought to find again." Tears glistened in Devine's eyes. "When Thomas left me at that altar, I thought it was the end of everything. I couldn't imagine anyone seeing past this chair." "I see nothing but you," James whispered. He knelt beside her chair, taking both her hands in his. "Devine Bennett, you may not be able to walk down an aisle to me, but I would be honored to walk through life beside you. Will you marry me?" She leaned forward until their foreheads touched. "Are you certain? A cattle baron's wife should be exactly what you are," he interrupted. "Strong. Intelligent. Kind. His voice dropped. The woman I love. William stirred between them, blinking sleepily. Did you ask her to be my mama yet, Pa? Divine laughed through her tears. Yes, he did. And did you say yes? The boy sat up, suddenly wide awake. She looked from William's hopeful face to James's loving one. Yes, she whispered. Yes, I did. If this story has touched your heart, please hit the like button and share it with someone who needs to be reminded that true love sees beyond physical limitations to the beauty within. On a summer day in 1876, under an arch of wildflowers, Divine Bennett married James Harrington. Her wheeled chair was decorated not with the lilies of her first failed wedding, but with wild prairie roses gathered by William's small hands. The same chapel that had witnessed her greatest humiliation now bore witness to her greatest joy. This time, when she entered, it was to find James already waiting, his eyes never leaving hers as her father wheeled her down the aisle. I promise to be your strength when you need it, your equal always, and to never see limitations where there are only different paths, James vowed, his voice carrying clearly through the packed chapel. Divine's response was equally moving. I promise to bring laughter back into your home, to be a mother to William, and to remind you daily that love doesn't require perfect circumstances, only perfect acceptance. There wasn't a dry eye in the congregation when William stepped forward with the rings, announcing proudly, God sent Miss Divine to be my mama, just like I asked. When James lifted her from the chair to carry her across the threshold of their home, he whispered against her hair, Welcome home, miracle. And Divine, who had once been abandoned and forgotten, found herself cherished and remembered, the answer to a child's prayer and a widower's unspoken longing. The story of Divine and James Harrington became legendary throughout Montana Territory, not because it was extraordinary, but because it reminded everyone of an essential truth: sometimes our greatest blessings arrive disguised as our deepest disappointments. Divine's wheeled chair, once a symbol of limitation, became instead a throne from which she ruled her domain with grace and wisdom. The Double H Ranch flourished under the joint stewardship of James and Divine, who proved that physical disability need not limit one's capacity to love, lead, and build a meaningful life. And William? He grew up knowing that prayers are sometimes answered in unexpected ways, and that family is built not by blood alone, but by the choice to love without reservation.